Hello and welcome to Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. My name is Ben Houck, and I'm pleased to be able to introduce the 42nd installment in our ongoing series. Our February 2026 episode features award-winning Canadian filmmaker and documentarian Kevin McMahon. He is the director of approximately 30 films, including McLuhan's Wake, which was released in 2002. In conversation with IGS President Lance Strate, he discusses his career as a journalist and filmmaker, the practice of making documentaries, the idea of nonfiction film, and media scholars Marshall McLuhan and Neil Postman. Let's listen in.
Welcome to another episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. I'm here with Kevin McMahon, documentarian. Is that too fancy a word for you, Kevin? Documentarian?
It is a fancy word. I usually say documentary filmmaker because I suppose documentarian could encompass other things, but I like that word. We don't get a lot of fancy words in my trade.
Well, there you have it. You've got one at least. And I thank you for joining us. Now, Kevin, my understanding is that you are Canadian. Is that rumor true by any chance?
That is true. I'm Canadian. I live in Toronto.
And were you born there?
No, I was born in Niagara Falls.
Niagara Falls.
It's my hometown. And the site of my first documentary, which is called, appropriately enough, The Falls.
Well, I love Niagara Falls. I remember going there when I was little. My parents going up there and going on Maid of the Mist, and did that again not too long ago, several years ago, before COVID. But as an older adult, well, so you started out in Niagara Falls, and you went to school there. You grew up there.
I grew up in Niagara Falls. I went to, early school there. And then I went to university, the first university not far from there, at a place called Brock University, which is in St. Catharines, which is a nearby city.
Mm.
And then I went to journalism school in Ottawa. I did a graduate degree in journalism and returned to Niagara and worked for the newspaper there. I worked for the daily newspaper called the St. Catharines Standard for 5 years before I left and went to England to study film. And that's how I got into documentary film.
Well, that is interesting, and that is, of course, one of the pathways into documentary. At least, as I mentioned to you before we began, I picked up a class at the last minute on documentary film, not making them, but just studying them. So I've been learning a lot more than learned a lot more than I used to know about that, and of course, at least one avenue is journalism. I mean, there are others like anthropology and ethnography, and government work, propaganda, and just straightforward filmmaking. But of course, documentary is an extension or a long form of news, just as like a feature article as opposed to a short news report. That's the comparison that was made. So that was how you got into documentary. Was you saw it as a kind of journalism?
I wouldn't actually say, I would agree with you that all of those other fields that you mentioned feed in, and in a way, those are all kind of present all the time when you're making documentaries. There's always something anthropological and so on. But I did see it, I guess, as an extension of journalism, but I also saw it as a something. I thought it was a medium that would give me the opportunity to do things that I could not do in a newspaper, for example, which was the kind of journalism that I did, because I wanted to learn to talk in pictures and with music, and to be able to just observe and let the observations stand for themselves.
Mm-hmm. So capture some aspect of reality that words don't quite get into.
Yeah, I never achieved the heights of the great documentarian from your neck of the woods who died last week, Frederick Wiseman,
Ah,
who was an inspiration early on, as he is, I think, for all documentary makers, not only for what he did, but for what he got away with.
uh-huh. Well, what do you mean by got away with?
Well, not many of us could make a 4-hour film and expect anybody to pay for it. But Fred could
Hmm.
and did make many of them. And just the kind of real purity of vision that he brought to the form, I think, was an inspiration to a lot of people. Even, I mean, the films that I make are not anything like Weissman films,
Hmm.
but nonetheless, his kind of devotion to the craft and the purity of his sense of what he was trying to do is always very inspiring.
Well, as I understand it, or as I've read about it, I mean, Fred Wiseman, kind of approach, and could be traced all the way back to Vertov and Kino Pravda, which becomes the basis of cinema verite. But and some argue that that's not the right term for his work, which was rather called direct cinema. Um, it's actually more or less involves less intervention than even cinema verite does. Does that match what you're understanding?
I would say so. I mean, weirdly enough, I've never actually studied documentary from a scholarly point of view, so I
Mhm.
sometimes get a little confused with the terms. When I think of Siga Vertov, I think of a kind of arty, even though he was recording what was happening on the streets of, I guess, Moscow.
Yeah.
Um, um, he was doing these overlays and double exposures and all this great stuff. And whereas Wiseman just turns the camera on. I mean,
Yeah.
of course, he varies the lens. Is it a wide shot? It's a close up, whatever. But it's almost the most neutral kind of observing you could possibly imagine.
Hmm.
Um, so I guess, yeah, direct cinema sounds like a good word for it. He weirdly enough didn't like to call his films documentaries. He liked to call them movies. And a lot of documentary makers are like that. The first film that I'm in partnership with my brother, we've been partners for all the films that we've made. And the first one we made, which was about Niagara Falls, we called it a nonfiction movie because the
Hmm.
very word documentary seemed to imply such boring earnestness that we wanted to distance ourselves from that and say, look, here's something that's real, but it's entertaining.
Yeah. And that phrase nonfiction film is also used, and it's one of the definitions, although it's interesting that there are no good definitions because, nonfiction can have a wide meaning that, I mean, say a biopic that with actors could still be considered nonfiction in its treatment. So, but that's different from what we're talking about. Um,
Yeah,
but
I would say, oh, sorry.
no, go ahead,
Well,
please.
I was just going to say on that point, the thing that's interesting and makes documentaries exciting is that there is no set form. Unlike dramatic movies, what most people would
Mhm.
think of as a Hollywood movie, Hollywood movies have a set form. As we know, there's a genre, so for most films that are made are within the genre. And if they're not a Western or a rom-com or a thriller or a horror, they are in conversation with that thing. There's
Mhm.
something a little different. I recently saw the movie Sinners, so it's kind of a horror movie, but it's not really. But it's using those tropes, so the audience is very familiar with it. The documentaries, every documentary is unique. The style that is brought to it is unique because aside from, say, maybe a current affairs long form journalism piece like what you'd see on 60 Minutes, say.
Yeah.
Those things do have a kind of set parameters. But long form documentaries can be anything and they can be all over the place and they can use any technique imaginable. So they're, I think, a more challenging and a more exciting medium. Now, I've never made a big drama movie. I'm sure it's not that easy to do, but conceptually, documentaries are a much more varied medium. So all those
Mhm.
labels, you could never have enough labels, really.
Yeah. And just on the point about Vertov, is that he used the phrase Kino Pravda, but uh, that's different from actually just doing what Wiseman did. It's just so interesting to bring him up because and he seems to, well, what actually, let me ask you, I mean, what of his work that really stands out for you then as a model or something that's inspiring or uh,
Fred Weisman's films?
yeah.
Well, they're all kind of inspiring. I just the other day rewatched, oh, what's it called? It's a town in Indiana. I think it's not Muncie, Indiana.
Hmm.
I forget the name. Monrovia. It's called Monrovia, Indiana. It's a
Uh-huh.
2.5 hour portrait of this small agricultural community in the middle of Indiana. It was made in 2018, but it could have been made in 1950. It was really fascinating to see. And it's just a very straightforward look at this place and the people who live there. And so I mean, to be honest, for a documentarian, it's a dream to be able to do that, to be able to just go and observe. It's typically very hard to do
Hmm.
because unless, well, at least for my generation, because my generation were people who made their living making these films.
Uh-huh.
When I started, we shot on film, and there was a lot more apparatus and a lot more money required. Now, of course, people may have the wherewithal to make a complete documentary just with the equipment they have in their back pocket. So it's possible to do these things. But typically, the reason that Wiseman stands out so much is that he would go into an institution or a community and say, I'm just going to observe this place for 6 months and then I'm going to see what I get. If you were to
Hmm.
go to a television broadcaster, say typically, I mean, he was funded by PBS, but if you were to go to a modern broadcaster like Netflix and say,
Hmm.
I'm just going to go into this place for 6 months and observe, can I please have the money to do that? The answer would be not a chance.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So again, one is inspired by the what he managed to achieve. I think he made more than 50 films, and they're all similar.
Hmm. Now, in general semantics, we have perhaps our best known phrase or saying is the map is not the territory. Um, you think of someone like Wiseman's work, and he's showing you, I mean, and the word direct cinema, he's giving you a direct view into something that you don't have access to on your own. But is it the same as being there? I mean, what is it that the filmmaker does that, makes it a map rather than a territory?
Interesting question. Well, the map is definitely not the territory. I saw an interesting example of this the other night. There's a film that's nominated for an Academy Award this year. It's called Mr. Nobody versus Putin.
Hmm.
And so this is a film. Do you know this film?
No, no, but please tell us about it.
It's a new documentary. It was made for the BBC, but it was made by a young guy who worked for an elementary school in rural Russia, and his
Hmm.
job was to be the school videographer. And he also kind of organized events and stuff at the school. And so he's going along, he's doing his job, he's shooting everything that happens in the school. And when the war in Ukraine started, the Russians started insisting that kids in school be, heavily propagandized, wearing uniforms, listening to patriotic speeches, being given bogus history lessons, and so on.
Hmm.
So this guy shoots all this stuff, and he's shooting it because it's part of his job. But he starts to realize that this isn't right. This isn't what he believes in. Anyway, long story short, he ends up teaming up with, I think, an American. I'm not sure why the BBC funded it because I think the director's American. But in any case, he teams up with this guy who's outside Russia and he starts funneling all of his footage out. And you can tell there were hundreds of hours of footage because he shot through a whole school year, and he shot everything. And this a guy called, his name's David Bornstein, I believe. And I think he's an American. He
Mhm.
gets all this material and he shapes it. And I read interviews with him where he talks about how he shaped it. And basically, he's
Uh,
shaping it into a narrative. You're taking a lot of abstract footage, and out of that, you're trying to tweezer some kind of a narrative through line. So he
mhm.
creates the guy who's doing the shooting, he creates him as a subject. Then he creates an antagonist, a teacher, the bad teacher, the mean teacher. So he imposes a narrative structure on this thing, and this is what we always have to do. We always have to impose some kind of narrative structure because film's a time-based medium. It's running from 1 to 90
Mhm.
or 50 or whatever it is.
Or
Uh,
500.
or 500 if you're Fred Weisman. Um, so that's the creation of the map. The creation of the map is taking the raw material and imposing a narrative structure on it. And, your goal, hopefully, is to impose a narrative structure that is truthful and truthful to the experience, truthful to the people, truthful to whatever they're trying to represent. Of course, that doesn't happen sometimes when people make propaganda films. They're imposing a narrative structure to skew the argument in a certain way.
Mhm.
Um, and we probably all do that to some extent. But, I think if you're an honest documentary maker, just like if you're an honest journalist, you're trying to do your best to show what you've experienced, but you have to show it through a story. So that's the making of the map.
Great. And maybe if we return to your own mapping, your own journey. Uh, so why did you decide to go to England and turn to filmmaking?
Well, I decided to turn to filmmaking because I'd become interested in university. I had profs that taught film, and I learned about it, and I was fascinated by it. This is the 1970s, there's like all the films coming from Europe, the French films, the German films, and
Yeah.
and it was a time when American cinema was interesting, Scorsese and all that, all
Uh,
those early independent American films. So I was fascinated by film, but Canada hardly had a film industry then. And it really had it did have some small film schools, but you are some departments that sort of taught film, but you had to do an undergrad, and I'd already done two of them. So I wanted a postgrad course, and the choices in those days were you could go to England or you could go to New York. And I looked at I applied to and was accepted by Columbia and NYU and Bristol in England.
mhm.
But my girlfriend at the time was doing a PhD in film, and she was more interested in England. And to be honest, I was more interested in England because I'd been raised
Uh,
in Niagara Falls. I felt I had, a sense of New York State. I didn't
yeah.
have a sense. I mean, I don't mean to offend New Yorkers because I know that New York City is not New York State, uh,
Right.
but I wanted the adventure. So we went to
Sure.
England, and I ended up staying there a couple of years. But why I wanted to go into film, as I was saying earlier, it's a way of um, expressing and capturing that is using media beyond writing. And I wanted to learn how to do that. I still love writing, and I do lots of writing. But
Mhm.
yeah, I wanted to learn a new way of speaking.
So you go to film school and then you come back to Canada to make your first film about
Yeah,
Niagara Falls.
yeah, and we made a feature documentary called The Falls, which is about Niagara Falls, and ultimately it's about the poisoning of the Niagara River, but it mixes the culture of the place because it's a tourist spot and has been for hundreds of years. So
Mhm.
it kind of tells the history of the place, through its culture, through the development of technology, hydro dams, and so on that harness the water for electricity, and then the heavy industry that came as a result of that, and how that heavy industry was used. And of course, it kind of, puts that all in the context of nature and of the Niagara River itself, which is quite a spectacular place, even though it's very built up around it. So yeah, so we made that film, and that film was a big success. It debuted at the Toronto Film Festival in, I think, 1990 or 1991, and it went on to play in cinemas here for a month and a half. So it
So
did
it's,
really well.
yes, it sounds like that combines history with something of I mean, nature documentaries are, of course, a longstanding subgenre, if you like, and historical uh, documentaries. But it sounds like there's a bit of advocacy involved there as well, kind of environmentalist approach.
Certainly is, and that has been really the hallmark of most of the films that I've made since then. I mean, we know each other because I made a film about Marshall McLuhan, and I've
Right.
done a couple of films about communications, but mostly my work has been about environmental subjects. And yeah, it's funny, the question of advocacy. I I was one thing about these films is I've always been pretty careful not to make the kind of documentary that says we have a problem here and it's caused by this person or this company or
Hmm.
this thing. We've always tried to look at things in a broad kind of societal um, from a societal perspective, in the hope that the films aren't, they're not advocacy and they're not investigative journalism either, in the sense that investigative journalism really does try to get, tries to bring it back to a specific source and often advocate for some sort of outcome. This person should be charged or
Hmm.
whatever. My films never do that. They're always about this is the general situation that we've all created, and these are the factors that typically the thing that interests me, these are the factors that prevent us from seeing what we're doing to ourselves. So they tend to take a non kind of advocacy point of view, in fact. And as a result, they typically don't have bad guys. And as a result, they typically don't do that well. I've always admired Michael Moore for his
Oh,
great success because, Michael doesn't think twice about, telling you whose fault it is. Um,
right.
and that's a kind of a populist approach that works very well. And I don't mean that as a criticism. I like him and I like his films.
Well, he has been criticized on that score for not not necessarily for the blame game as much as for not being completely honest or being manipulative in some ways. I was reading about how in Bowling for Columbine, the critics felt he took advantage of Charlton Heston when he's interviewing him. That here's this really kind of old fellow at this point who's unable to respond, you know, well to this sort of confrontation, and that they felt like that was kind of going beyond what a documentary filmmaker should be doing.
Well, that's almost key to his practice. I mean, his first film, Roger
Mhm.
and Me, is about chasing the guy that runs General Motors, trying to get
Yeah,
him to own up to the damage that his company had done in Flint, Michigan. So, I mean, but the thing I would say I never agreed with that actual criticism, the Charlton Heston thing,
yeah,
which is, I remember from the time, partly because Heston had put himself forward as an advocate for a certain point of view. So if you're going to do that, you have to stand up for the point of view. But
right.
also because people could see very well what was happening in that moment, so they could judge for themselves. I think
Mhm.
it would be much worse if you can always cut something in such a way as to make someone look stupid or to make them
Yeah.
say so you can edit things to make people say anything you want them to say. But Yeah, I mean, again, Michael's both his success and his and the critique comes from the fact that he's straightforwardly political. He
Yeah.
straightforwardly advocates, and I mean, and he participates in your politics in a very forward way.
His response to the critics has been to say he's not really doing documentaries.
Well, that's right, and
Yeah.
fair enough. I must say one of my happiest moments as a filmmaker was I made a film called Water Life. And it's
Hmm.
a documentary that follows, sort of theoretically follows, a drop of water from the north shore of Lake Superior all through the Great Lakes out to the Atlantic Ocean.
Oh,
It's a way of
nice.
talking about all the issues in the watershed and so on. It's a really pretty film. It's got a lot of pop music, and it's a nice film. And in fact, played at Michael Moore's Traverse City Film Festival. But there's a community up in northern Michigan somewhere. Is it Michigan? Yeah, Michigan, called Elk Rapids. The little town, it's kind of a
Mm.
touristy town, I guess, but it's rural. So it's split between red and blue. And I, whatever. This is a lot. This is 15 years ago, but they already hated each other. Um, and they had this little environmental film festival, and they invited my film to come and play, and I showed it and talked to the people and stuff. And the organizers told me that they had invited the film because it was the only environmental film that they could find that wasn't pointing fingers at a specific group, and
Hmm.
therefore could be shown to a mixed, an audience that included, I guess, Republicans and Democrats. And so I was really happy with that
Yeah.
because the environment is a common space and a common problem.
Hmm.
And I very much regret that it's so politicized because I don't think it's in anyone's interests for it to be so.
Yeah. Well, or could it be that this is a byproduct of being Canadian and you're too polite to point fingers?
Well, it could be that, but it's not that I'm too polite. It's that I think it's intellectually weak to do it.
Hmm.
I think if you're talking about something like the Great Lakes, you're talking,
Yeah.
or Niagara Falls for that matter, you're talking about this, this thing that clearly is been acted upon by the collectivity of humanity.
Hmm.
So I think it's just kind of cheap to say, well, like it's,
Sure.
US Steel's fault or whatever, it's everybody's fault.
Yeah. So in other words, we're dealing with very complex kind of situations, and it's an oversimplification to just say, oh, it's this person's fault or that person's fault. It also kind of means that we, meaning the audience, the viewer, doesn't have to feel any responsibility because we know whose fault it is. The fault lies in the stars and not in us.
Exactly. It's exactly that. And also you don't have to change your perspective. I
Mm.
guess it's sort of the same thing.
Yeah.
It's if you can blame the bad guy, I mean that's one of the I would say that is one of, speaking of general semantics, one of the uh how can I put it? One of the harms
Mhm.
Hollywood cinema has given us, that to view everything through a heroic narrative where there's a good
Mhm.
guy and a bad guy, and, that very old kind of narrative structure. I don't, I mean, it makes for fun movies, sure, but as a worldview, it's limited and well, it's inaccurate, is what it is.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent point, and it certainly speaks to some of what we're unfortunately dealing with today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You couldn't have you can't really have a strong man politics until you believe in strong man to begin with as a solution.
Yeah. And that sort of like taking the role of the hero, having identified the villain or villains that um, need to be fought against and defeated. And yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, I've been lately studying E.O. Wilson. I don't know if
Mm.
you remember E.O. Wilson, the great
Sure,
American
sure.
biologist, where he developed this. theory of eusociality, which is a theory of evolution based on group dynamics, essentially. Basically, he argues that Homo sapiens are so great at taking over the world because we were really good at cooperating amongst our groups and really great at opposing any other kind of group. So,
Right.
we know this, we know it from psychological and sociological research too. The hero myths really appeal to innate things that are built into us, that are coded into our genes.
Hmm.
So, if we want our culture to kind of expand us somewhat, we have to kind of get beyond that.
Yeah. Very interesting. And of course, a lot of that relates to systems theory as well, that, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And
100%.
thinking in those terms, whether it's an ant colony or a human community.
And in fact, Wilson learned it from ant colonies.
I
He
have,
spent his whole life studying ants and eventually realized, hey, they're just like us.
yeah, which also speaks to ecology.
100%.
So, given that theme, when you're making these films, and is there an effect that you are trying to get at? That since there's no villain that you're pointing to, is there some kind of purpose beyond the film itself that you're trying to get the audience, to engage in, to take some kind of action, uh, or to gain some kind of understanding?
I think it's the latter more than anything. I mean, there's a big thing in documentaries for about the past 10 years or maybe 15 years because a lot of money now for documentaries comes from foundations. And in this country, it mostly comes from government, but in the United States, it mostly comes from foundation. And in either case, for some reason, documentaries, unlike drama or any other genre, are expected to make an impact. And there, in fact, are impact funds where they take your film and they try to change a law or whatever, or get somebody arrested, whatever the
Yeah.
purpose of the film is. And yeah, that's not my jam. I don't think that is our job. I think that's the legislator's job. Our job, I think, is to um, provide a window. It's to provide the widest possible window so that people are moved, because cinema essentially it's an emotional, even though my films tend to be kind of brainy, the crux of cinema is emotional in the way that we receive them. So
Mhm.
I'm trying to move people while trying to get them to see the complexity of a given situation and appreciate it. And hopefully look at the world a little differently. I mean, that's I think all any kind of cultural form can do is get you to look at the world a little differently and get you to question things. So I never have the specific purpose of
Mhm.
once you've seen this film, you will clean up this river because it doesn't happen, you know.
Yeah.
And you don't know whatever the threat to the thing is today, it's going to be something different tomorrow. So the idea is to try and get people to look at all of the ways things interact and what the potential threats are to them and to the world that they live in.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Canadian Film Board, and I think it's worthwhile bringing up, and it's particularly for folks here in the United States that we don't realize this, that Canada and really most other countries, the government provides quite a lot of subsidies for the arts, including for filmmakers, for doing films that are not, sort of big theatrical releases, including documentaries. So you get much of your funding from the Canadian Film Board, as I understand it, and yeah, I mean, I even have friends who like say in the poetry world in Canada who are subsidized by the government, and that allows them to actually be poets. But here in the U.S., that pretty much doesn't happen. And even what we've seen in the last year has been these drastic cuts to public broadcasting, which was and to the folding of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and that was a major source of funding for documentary film. As we mentioned, Fred Wiseman, somehow he keeps coming up here, but I mean, his work was shown on PBS, and that was a support and an outlet. Do you want to say something about the Canadian
Sure.
film board?
Sure. I will, just for your listeners, in case they got to look this up. It's called the National Film Board of Canada, and it has a great website that anyone can go to and see thousands of films for free. Almost all of them are either documentaries or animation. They do a lot of, and they've won dozens of Academy Awards for their animations. They do very creative animation. But I mean, what Americans perhaps don't realize is that everywhere in the world, and certainly strongly everywhere in the Western world, there are vast amounts of money that are put into public culture, and it's specifically and directly targeted to keep American culture at bay. Because I mean, in Canada, of course, we feel this so acutely, and now you're threatening to actually invade our country. But the
I'm so
economic,
sorry.
yeah, well, I don't hold you responsible, Lance. But the economic and cultural imperialism that a place like Canada is subject to is off the charts. It's incomparable to anywhere else. It's only comparable, it wouldn't even be comparable to like Finland and Russia because there's a language barrier. Because
Mhm.
we have no language barrier, and because our economy is largely a branch plant economy, which is why it's so easily threatened. Um, that's always been an enormous issue here. The reason why we have the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is a public broadcaster on the same model as the BBC, with the
Mhm.
National Film Board of Canada, the three biggest provinces, Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia, all have their own public broadcasters. And then there are, all kinds of arts councils and, other kinds of funding. And there are the government of Canada supports two big investment banks. One that invests money in dramatic feature films for movies or streaming or whatever, and the other supports television. So, heated rivalry, which everybody knows about at the moment. That was done, I bet you it's 99% public money. I mean, I think they sold it to Netflix, so they got some money or whatever. But so almost all culture that's made in this country is publicly funded. But that's true of all of Europe too. We do a
Yeah.
lot of co-productions with Germany and with Japan. And in both of those countries, there are enormous apparatuses to support public funding of the arts. And it's frankly because Hollywood is so good at what it does that it basically produces a kind of mental candy floss that everybody can relate to, that everybody admires, that everybody, wants to be a part of, and has
Mhm.
been until now so good at creating a star system and all that, that every other country since the Second World War has felt threatened by that.
Yeah.
And every other country has had also, because of the way American trade representatives work, every other country has been afraid to keep American product out. So in
Mhm.
the same way that, say, the United States does not let Chinese cars come into the country, Canada couldn't say, you know what, we're not having any American movies for a while. We're just going to have our own movies because the American trade representatives, until now, have gone ballistic when that's happened.
Mhm.
And the curious situation that Trump has created, our mutual friend Cory Doctorow talks about this, that because
Mhm.
Trump threatens everybody all the time with tariffs, the cultural suasion that America used to have by saying, if you don't, if you don't take our movies, we're going to hit you with more tariffs. That doesn't really work anymore. So that's why the Europeans are saying, you know what, we're going to put regulations on social media, on these big American, we call them tech companies, but really they're communication companies.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so that is the situation. But if you go to Germany or France, I mean, France, oh my God, to live in France as a filmmaker. I mean, in Canada, we have public subsidies, but we all live on poverty wages. A friend of mine who is a great documentary filmmaker used to say that to make documentaries, you have to begin with a vow of poverty, as if you were a Jesuit, you know? But I also often say that the only kind of filmmaker that you would want to be in Canada versus the States, if you make drama, you want to live in Hollywood. There's no question. Everything's going to be better. You're going to have better everything. Technology, money, stars, actors, whatever. But if you make documentary, you're better off in Toronto than you are in New York. Because in Toronto, there's actually relative to the States, a lot of supports, where in the States you had the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and PBS and, and foundations, the Ford Foundation, Sundance Foundation, these places. But these places are small and oversubscribed and also very particular about what they fund. So it's a much, I think, if I lived in the States, I would probably be a teacher at a university as well as make films. Here I'm able to be, and always have been able to be, a professional filmmaker.
Now, in all fairness, I do want to note that there are quite a lot of Canadians in Hollywood.
Oh, there are. Yeah, of course they're in Hollywood because they would be having
the real
shitty careers if
conspiracy.
they were here. Yeah, yeah.
The real conspiracy is how Canadians have taken over American movies and television to a large extent. But
there's a lot for sure. There's a lot. Although, the people who are most successful there are the Quebecois. Because the Quebecois.
Well, I love Villeneuve.
Well, he's a great filmmaker, and they have actually they probably have the most sophisticated culture in North America, although it's all in French. But I mean, even we envy them because they are able to make films the way they want to make them. And they kind of have a captive audience, They have they have the language barrier that creates a moat around them. So they have a very powerful culture, and they, as a result, turn out really good artists who achieve a level that is Hollywood level and can easily jump to Hollywood. Whereas it's harder in English Canada because dramatists don't get to make that many films. You're lucky if you make 4 or 5 films in your career here.
Yeah, that's interesting. That language barrier, I think, extends to some extent to France itself, because I've heard that people from France have difficulty understanding Quebecois French.
That's true.
But you mentioned the BBC as well, and speaking of documentary, I mean, Grierson was considered one of the sort of founding fathers, if you like. I mean, a little after Flaherty, but and he also helped to start documentary work in Canada as well.
Absolutely. I've written, I should tell you this, I've written several times that Canadians can lay claim to documentary as an indigenous art form. And there really is no other art form aside from canoe making that we can claim. But Flaherty, though Flaherty was an American, he did all his most important work in Canada, and he lived in Toronto while he was editing his films, and he, as you probably know, he had to make his film twice because he accidentally burned the footage the first time. So so we kind of claim him as a Canadian. And this is an interesting little tangent, but I made a doc in the Arctic about 3 years ago.
Ooh.
And it was a climate change thing. It was about, what's going to happen when the Arctic Ocean is a blue ocean and how does Canada relate to that and all that. But the fascinating part of the story was I met a woman called Kyra Flaherty. She's half Inuit and
Hmm.
half Caucasian, but she's the great granddaughter of Robert Flaherty, and
Wow.
she's an avid TikToker, and she TikToks. And she puts out these TikTok videos that are about life in the North, and particularly about how expensive life in the North is. And so she gets people, I don't think she asks them, but they just do this. They send food to the North because food's very expensive in the high North. And she distributes it to her community. So,
Hmm.
so it's this crazy, Flaherty started documentary, and here's his
Yeah.
great granddaughter making what are documentaries, but 3 minute long TikTok things. But then to come to Grierson, I mean, yeah, Grierson was the founding father of the National Film Board of Canada, and he set the both the aesthetics and tone. So he from the beginning encouraged people to make beautiful, artful films that told compelling stories. But he also he was basically working against fascism and in the service of democracy. And he argued that what was important about documentary was that it was representing the world and it was showing people, it was building community, I guess, and helping to educate people, and that it just so happened they had film to use. If he had had TikTok, he would have been all over it.
Mm.
Because he said the medium doesn't matter. This just happens to be what we have, and it's the most convenient thing, and it's the thing of the moment. So he was a big believer in documentary as something that widened perspectives and I think in his case did, lead to rectification of social ills.
Yeah. But it's also very strong on getting institutional support and getting governments to get into the game and provide that support.
Well, he was a Brit. He was a Scot actually, and he worked for the post office in Britain where they
Yeah.
had a filmmaking unit. But he was tapped by the Canadian government to come here and set up the National Film Board. And
Yeah.
so the DNA of the thing is all Grierson. He ran it. I don't know how many years. I want to say 20 years. I'm not sure, but I mean, he certainly set the foundation of it, and it basically still operates today the way he set it up.
Yeah. And now you were talking about Flaherty, and that, of course, is the famous film Nanook of the North, and in the that which is something that Edmund Carpenter, McLuhan's colleague, was quite critical of for
Mm.
misrepresenting uh, Eskimo life. Which brings us to Marshall McLuhan. You did bring him up before, but certainly within our milieu, here with media ecology, that is the film that we're most familiar with from you, and of course, it's how we first met, um, which is what almost a quarter of a century ago. It's that.
Long time.
Oh my God, I hate thinking about that, but
So do I.
yeah. But how did you come to do that film? How did that get going?
I was invited to do that film by a broadcaster. The guy who happened to run the provincial public channel at the time had a friend who was a McLuhan scholar, and they felt this is 19 what year was this? We made that film. Well, actually, it was 2000. We made
It
that
was
film in 2000.
2002 when it came out.
By the time it got to New York, yeah. Um, and it premiered in New York at Fordham. Um, but they wanted to make a film and they didn't really know how to do it. And so the broadcaster asked me, will you take this on? And I had, I was aware of McLuhan's work. I'd studied him a little bit in university. I was fascinated by it.
Mhm.
So I took it on, and it took about a year of working with this guy who was the scholar for me to really feel like I had a strong grasp of the ideas.
Do you remember who
Um,
that was?
yeah, there's a guy called David Sobelman. He's not
Okay,
alive anymore, and he wasn't
right.
he was a quirky character. He wasn't really a scholar, but he had actually been a student of McLuhan's, and he was utterly enamored with McLuhan. And yeah, so I took it on, and and what interested me, I mean, everything about McLuhan's interesting. His own narrative is interesting, a kind of rise and fall story. And at the time that we made the film, he was kind of being resurrected. Wired magazine wasn't very old, and Wired
Yeah.
magazine had made him their patron saint. And, it was the rise of digital technology. The internet was barely begun. So people were thinking about McLuhan in the same way that people now in some places are thinking about Neil Postman, who was actually a student of McLuhan's.
Right. And who
So
you interviewed for the film.
I did. I also interviewed Ted Carpenter for the film.
Right.
Um, but it was the right moment to make that film, and I was interested because McLuhan was very interested in environments. As you know, he talked about how technologies create environments, and
Right.
so that was a really compelling idea for me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it remains the standout film about Marshall McLuhan. Uh, Still today. I mean, I still have, when I teach media ecology, I have my class watch the film.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah. Uh, well, and you mentioned Neil Postman, so maybe we can bring this up. I mean, you're really just starting out on this, but you're thinking or intending to make another documentary about Neil Postman, who was, of course, associated both, and he coined the term media ecology, but also was involved with general semantics and edited the General Semantics Journal, etc., for a decade. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to this point with Postman?
Weirdly, again, very similar. The person who's now running the provincial broadcaster felt that Postman's kind of intellectual star was rising again.
Hmm.
And I think I was just reading before I got on the call a essay from the Atlantic published 2 days ago that's about literature and orality. And and Postman's great theme, of course, was the way in which the literary world was kind of undermined by the electronic world.
Right.
And so that interests me. And um, so I've been, as I say, I'm just getting started on it. But I think the thing that is really pertinent from Postman. And it's not, I mean, we could talk about this. You know much more about Postman than I do, but it's not just Postman, but that the distinction between those two different kinds of ways of viewing the world, which of course, therefore, are the two ways of media, of having a discourse about the world. Are we, and I think you can really clearly see in this moment the distinction between people who are kind of literature people who are still, focused on rationality and reason and let's think this through. And okay, now we're in a pandemic. Why don't we create a vaccine to stop that pandemic? All those kinds
Yeah.
of arguments of logic. I must say I'm probably a literature person myself because I look at the environment and I think, why don't people see the logic of dealing with the climate change problem or the toxins problem or the plastics problem?
Right.
Um, it's illogical that we would not deal with these problems. But I think Postman, whose most famous book was Amusing Ourselves to Death, he argued that because public discourse had been taken over by digital media, well, he didn't call them that, he called it television
Television.
because it was
Yeah.
television. But because public discourse had been taken over that way, it was incapable of,
Hmm.
we were back to kind of sitting around the campfire arguing things in a very kind of oral world that didn't really allow for the rational thinking through of ways of dealing with problems.
Right. Although I would say he didn't say we were back to that. I mean, he really is that we're into something new and
Mm, mm,
unprecedented
mm.
in that regard, because let's not put down those people sitting around the campfire because they know when things are going wrong. I mean, there's no sort of, and to use a term that he was known to use, there was no bullshit. Um, Around back then. I mean, they might have had irrational beliefs about things, but when it comes to survival, a fact is a fact. Um, and
Absolutely, and I wouldn't want to be interpreted. It's funny, I actually had this, I'm slightly having this argument with the broadcasters because I wouldn't want this to be interpreted as a value judgment. And in fact, in my work in the environment, I've spent a lot of time working with indigenous people in this country who interestingly enough, because they come from oral cultures originally, are easy masters of digital culture, which is a whole other interesting story. So,
right,
no, I don't see it as a value judgment, but I mean, I think the problem is that we have all of these institutions, science, law, the academy, et cetera, that were built on this logical edifice
yes,
that are
exactly.
now challenged by this digital conversation that, and well, certainly the literature side does not know how to respond to that.
Right.
I don't know about, and on the digital side, there's a multitude of motives out there and a multitude of arguments. But anyway, so what interests me is that contrast because I think we're in a moment of transition where people are entirely speaking past one another.
Yeah. And this is, I mean, to go back to, I mean, general semantics and where Neil Postman and me, was very much in line with this is that, it's enlightenment, rationality, and science and empiricism that the modern world was built on. And, I mean, on both sides of the spectrum, I mean, when you get to the extremes of the left and the right, there's the rejection of that, of modernity and of the Enlightenment because there were some bad things that were going on and that were justified that way. But, I mean, that it was the method of coming to terms with reality um, that that was key, and that again, that Postman saw that television as moving us away from. Uh, in a way, it's sort of interesting how you'll approach this because in some ways that's a critique of audiovisual media, which includes film. Although I will say that Postman was very much enamored with film, but of course older film more so. But when I was like just a young graduate student, I would get teased a lot because I didn't know all those old classic Hollywood movies that, they were making these references to.
Well, I am aware of the fact that Postman would probably think what I'm entering on is a fool's errand, that he would probably argue it is impossible to talk about rationality through this medium, and he may well be right. But so I'm thinking it through, trying to think through what are the physical marks on the landscape that might speak to this. But I mean, he did say he loved entertainment television. He just didn't think it should be taken seriously. I
Right.
don't know what I've never actually read anything that he said about documentaries, so I don't know what he thought about that. But
I don't think he ever
yeah,
addressed that.
yeah. So I don't know, but whatever. It's the medium I work in, so I'm gonna give it my best shot.
Yeah, and he was more than happy to appear on television to say these things.
I mean, one of the reasons that if you want to talk, I was just thinking about this because in the article I was reading, they were talking about Walter Ong and McLuhan. The thing about, and these guys were all in this regard making, I think, well, you would know better than I do, but I think they're making a similar argument. The great thing about Postman is he was on TV all the time. There's
Yeah.
reams of footage of him.
Yeah.
So we can actually, he's a great figure to use to look at this argument because there's lots of material.
And of course, that's very important for at least one approach, not so much the Fred Wiseman approach, but for
That's
many
right.
others, archival footage and putting that together. But he was not quite the same. I'll say, I mean, just that article misrepresents on who would never refer to something like digital orality. And would really meant sound and
Mm,
speech by orality and not
mm,
texting or these other kinds of things. And even then, when it's electronically mediated, it's quite different from genuine, original oral culture. So it's not the best way explanation. And for Postman, it really was that what television had done was not retrieve orality, but introduced image culture or amplified image culture um, to the point that it had become dysfunctional, and that really is the key turning point, and that never existed before. We've
mm.
never had so many images. People never knew what, we're never so familiar with famous people's faces and and put so much store on the way people look. Uh, to the point of, I mean, again, in politics and in all these other things, this complete distortion of what's going on.
Well, this is something I'm going to have to come and interview you about because I'm very curious now about whether, I mean, it seems to me that online communication, social media, for example, it's
Mhm.
some weird mixture. I mean, it has all of the non-linearity that Postman complained about and the kind of disjointed aspects. So you can't really have, it's very hard to have serious conversations. But, and sometimes it's speaking through memes and images, and sometimes it's speaking through words. Is it
Mhm.
a literary medium or is it
Yeah.
more akin to a book or more akin to a television show or neither?
He would definitely say, and I just echo it, the television. It's all television. It's
Uh,
just television writ large. I mean, you see words, and I mean, there's some speech on television, and there's some uh, print, sort of electronic print that appears on the screen. But what do? We watch TV.
mm, mm.
Right. I mean, that's we do, you can listen to it, but mainly we watch it and that's what it's about. So, but I
But we,
think, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, and is that how you perceive us to consume social media? Because it's, again, some kind of weird hybrid. We're mostly watching, but we can, participate in these
Yeah.
little bitty ways.
Well, that's, there is more interaction, but, when we come down to it, one of the, more recent folks talk about deep reading and the loss of that you don't just sit and read a long essay. And Postman was a um, uh, uh, big promoter of expository writing, and that kind of goes by the wayside. And instead, we get these little bits and pieces and jumping around and constant distraction. Um, so, uh, that's quite different from sitting down with a book and spending hours just reading.
I wonder too how much, and this is something we'll try to get out in the film, how much um, is there the distinction between emotive content and kind of logical content? In a long essay,
Yeah,
you're going to argue your point. You may try to move the reader, but you're essentially trying to, like that
yeah.
great thing Postman said, you can't write and not make meaning.
Hmm.
You can make meaning and make emotive meaning easily on the internet without actually making an argument.
Oh, and that, I mean, that's one of his key elements. It goes back to others like Suzanne Langer, is a great philosopher of the mid-20th century, that images are not propositional. They don't make statements, but they evoke feelings. And so when the discourse is dominated by images, you get a lot of emotion, but not a lot of clear thinking or logic or reason.
Yeah, and to bring it back to documentary, that's why it's it's always a challenge if you're trying to make films that are trying to get people to think. You have to kind of go through the heart to get to their brain. And I mean, and lots of dramatists, of course, this is what they're up to as well. But you're a little bit working with one hand tied behind your back.
That's a great way to put it, and I think Postman would happily acknowledge that, but would also encourage you to do your best at fighting with that one hand and getting these messages through, because we need to convey them in all the means that are available to us.
I agree.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, this has been great. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Totally my pleasure, Lance. Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to the February 2026 episode of Semantic Reactions, featuring Kevin McMahon. If you like what you've heard, or even if you haven't, please consider becoming a member of the Institute of General Semantics if you're not one already. In addition to supporting our efforts, IGS members receive an annual subscription to our journal, etc., a review of general semantics, access to our online and in-person events, lectures, and seminars, and discounts on the books and audiovisual materials that we sell. Regular membership is only $50 and half off for students. Your membership and any additional donations you care to make will help to support our offerings and activities as we work to bring a measure of sanity to the world. The Institute of General Semantics is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to research and education on a wide range of topics. They include language and symbols, meaning and perception, communication and representation, media and technology, science and epistemology, creativity, and critical thinking. We are dedicated to making the world a better place through practical strategies for improving our semantic environment, individually and collectively. For more information about the Institute and our activities, and to become a member and supporter of our work, please visit our website at generalsemantics.org. That's generalsemantics, one word, .org. And this brings to a close our 42nd episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. This is Ben Houck, signing off, saying, we hope you'll join us next time. And until then, just remember this simple fact, that the map is not the territory.